It's going to horrify you. It's going to shock you. It's going to appall you. It's going to shake you to your ontological bones. But that's the kind of the amazing thing about DMT, is that it is so democratic.
Dr. Andrew Gallimore, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's an honor and it's a pleasure. There's so many different things that, I want to talk to you about and ask you about, but because we are short on time, I'm going to try and streamline something central. And then if it's fun and enjoyable, we can maybe do it again at some other time. First, I want to say that in many circles, you don't really need a lot of introduction because you're a very known person in the psychedelic research space. If I'm not mistaken, you're a computational neurobiologist. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of my resume, I guess. Yeah, computational neurobiologist, chemical pharmacologist. Those are the two main things. Yeah, biochemist. Yeah,
and you're an author. You wrote two very wonderful books. I always recommend them to people. They definitely did a lot. I took a lot from them. Alien Information Theory and Reality Switch Technologies. In Alien Information Theory, you do a superb job at, I know that ideas evolve and it may be kind of hard to listen to, recapitulating what you wrote in your first book, but I think it is important. You're basically kind of outlining this, first of all, you're teaching people about some generalities about computation, how it maps onto what we understand about the mind, the brain, and how it can potentially relate to all of these unique substances, specifically with DMT. And then in Reality Switch Technologies, you take a deeper dive into what neuroscience actually is. You then go through all the substances through what we actually understand. And then you kind of outline why we think they do what they do. And then at the end, you focus on DMT and explain why, in your opinion, from a neuroscientific perspective, it does stand out to a substantial degree. And now you're finishing your third book, which I'm very excited about. Do you want to touch on it shortly?
Sure. Well, it won't be out until July 1st, I'm told by the publisher, but these dates can always change. But yeah, this will be purely focused on DMT. So I don't discuss, well, in passing, other drugs, but basically this is purely focused on DMT, the history, the science, the great mystery, really, of how the centuries long struggle, or at least a century anyway, of science to try and understand how and why this molecule has these astonishing effects on consciousness and on the structure and dynamics of your world, and how do we explain it? Do we need to invoke some kind of external intelligent agent in order to do so? That kind of thing. Yeah. So that's basically all I can say at the moment, but it will be purely about DMT. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm very excited about when it's going to come out. Definitely going to read it. So this actually might be a good thread to pull, because one of the things I was thinking about, I do a daily live and people ask all kinds of questions. And one of the things that always comes up is when I start talking about, let's say, computation and things like that, it becomes clear to me that these terms, they're a little murky for most people. And I'm pretty sure that when you're an expert in any particular field, the granularity with which you see the subject and what it really is, the essence of that thing, becomes a lot more mature. And there's a certain framework that of ontology that an expert has about any particular subject they're an expert in, that most people wouldn't have. So I wonder, what would you define, if at all, maybe you don't think about it in these terms, when you think about these very phantasmagorical, incredible spaces, with your knowledge of neuroscience and also understanding of the molecule and what it does, aside from what people experience, but also from a pharmacological perspective, how do you view your ontology? For example, would it be fair to say that thinking of the world at bottom as, informational, computational is more than a metaphor? Or is there like some kind of a completely different thing that you've now arrived at from your investigations? I would love for you to speak a little bit about that. How do you view your own ontology? What do you feel at the moment is the most fundamental thing that we can talk about?
Well, it's. I mean, in my first book, it's very much a computational, or really, it's drawn from digital physics and the idea that the ground of reality is fundamentally information. But what that even means, I don't know if anyone really sure. What does it mean? It's fundamentally information. Information is normally instantiated in some kind of substrate. I mean, that's how we define it. You have a number of states that you can select from. It might be digits, ones and zeros, or it could be heads and tails. It doesn't really make any difference. You just need a certain number of discrete states from which you can select. And this is how you generate information. So the idea of pure information is, for many people anyway, simply doesn't really make any sense, because information is always defined in terms of a substrate. So really what you're asking is at the ground of reality, what is the basic substrate? And is it digital, or is it continuous, or is it something else? Whilst I do kind of lean heavily towards, or I explicitly use a digital computational ontology and alien information theory in my first book, that's not it's not an idea I'm wedded to. This was just one. I was really just incubating and exploring an idea in that first book. I don't know the fundamental. I think one thing about what that DMT does is it completely extirpates any of your prior ontologies. You can go in there with a very clear idea of what is the fundamental ground of reality and how it's structured, and the limits upon, the limits and the boundaries, and what is and isn't possible. All of that, and all of that is completely obliterated, and it's fundamentally uprooted, and you have to start again in a very literal sense, in that nothing that made sense before that experience makes sense now. And this is why I think all of the theoretical physicists and the I don't want to name names, but the people who are rather sure of themselves, they're generally mathematical physicists, because they see themselves as being the arbiters of what is and isn't possible, and what is and isn't true. And I've always avoided that, because I think it all goes out the window once within a few seconds of a good lungful of DMT, and all of that's gone, and it doesn't make any sense anymore. Nothing makes any sense, at least relative to what used to make sense in the normal waking world. So yeah, I can't answer that question definitively. Sorry, but
I'm with you 100% on that, because what I find is that when, like, we're talking about the people that are so sure of themselves about defining reality, they are contradicting themselves constantly by saying, for example, if you talk to them, basically the answer you just gave, because most scientists would say, yeah, I mean, computation ultimately is a physical process that we see as computation. But then when you really think about it, well, first of all, there is some kind of an abstraction that is operating here, and you can say, that the interaction of physical objects give rise to this kind of thing that we call computation. Forget about the fact that it's kind of orthogonal to the laws of physics, and it doesn't really arise from any law of physics. It's just kind of like there. But then when then in the same breath, they can talk about the wave function collapse, and you ask them what the wave function is, and they say, well, it's a probabilistic wave. They're like, wait, probability measures probability of something. What is, you're talking about pure probability of what? So it's like a complete contradiction. And then when you bring into, the actual experiential part, which I think is important to take on board, specifically with DMT, it's almost like there's just a negation of even an attempt to engage with these assumptions in a way that can actually be very fruitful. And yet it's constantly being buffered by this kind of like invisible bias, so to speak. And this is, I think, why it's so important that, and so exciting, that some people that are, I guess you like, not just like explorers, like serious scientists who take these things more seriously and explore them bravely, in a way that also gives more merit to these ideas from a more scientific perspective.
I mean, I think the problem, part of the problem, is that there's this intraversible, if that's a word, gulf between the kind of the trip reports that you might read, and the kind of the immensity and the immediacy of the actual experience, and all of these people that call entity encounters illusory social events, or or dreamlike phenomena. They're kind of painting over what is a profoundly mysterious phenomenology with things that are much more easily tractable, so to speak. And as long as in their head, people who have never actually used DMT, these scientists, right? And in their head, as long as it's just dreamlike phenomena, it's just geometric hallucinations, it's just the brain, agent modeling by the brain, illusory social events, and all this kind of stuff. They simply avoid the problem by denying that there is a problem to be solved here, I think.
This is a point that sometimes I make. I want you to tell me if the point I'm making is a fair point, or I might want to reframe. What I tend to say is that the fact that we know about the electromagnetic spectrum in general is because we have eyes first. I mean, yes, we develop tools to engage with the broader spectrum of what exists, and then we postulate, we make hypotheses, we build instruments, we test, and all of that. But it always starts with some basic experience of the spectrum in order for you to even know it's there. And I feel like if you enter any space in which there's a new, like with DMT in particular, right? You have to first entertain the fact, well, first of all, hold on, there's this wave of experience that is tangible for a lot of people. Now you can start asking questions about what spectrum you're looking across. Or do you feel that if the thing is real, then no matter, even if you don't have the senses for it, eventually you'll somehow stumble upon it, so to speak?
Well, I think, certainly in the past, historically, your initial premise is probably true, in that everything starts with observation and using the eyes, because that's all we had. In the modern era, I think that's not necessarily true. Subatomic particles, for example, right? Nobody saw a subatomic particle or whatever, or it all came from theory, really. People detecting the Higgs boson, the one they got really excited about. That came from theory, and it was detected by a very extremely sophisticated and powerful machine.
Sounds like you're not a fan of the Higgs boson.
Well, no, I'm not saying that, but my excitement is limited by these kind of things. I think if you look hard enough for something and you strongly believe it, that you might well detect it. I don't know. I'm not a particle physicist, so I don't want to disparage what they do at all. But my point is that no one would have. It wasn't the eyes that we were using, right? It was using theory and then very, very advanced machines to detect things. So, but of course, it all now, I think the kind of the progression of physics and of science and of epistemology, what we know about reality is to some extent, with DMT. Let me try and frame that in a different way. With DMT, the problem you have is that you are confronted with spaces. From my perspective, it's not just about the phenomenology is very, very strange, because that's obviously true. The phenomenology it's inordinately strange. It's bizarre. It's impossible. Things happen within that space that cannot happen in the normal waking world. And so that's always been my starting position. I think with DMT, it is all about the phenomenology. It is all about the experience initially, but then you have to, at some point, you have to say, okay, where do we take this now? How do we analyze this, and how do we try to make sense of it? And with the Higgs boson, it would have been, this particle fell out of these equations and it needs to be there, and we'll build a collider and this is going to detect it. With DMT, it's a completely different problem, right? For me, I've always fallen back onto the neuroscience and thinking about how worlds are constructed by the brain and the limits of that. And so try to kind of eliminate the possibility, or So the null hypothesis, I guess, is that this is just a hallucination. This is just your brain. It's a wild cortical fabrication. This has to be your default position on the matter of DMT. So that's where I've always started is, okay, let's assume it's a hallucination. Let's assume it's purely a fabrication of the brain. You know, all worlds are fabrications of the brain, and we have to start from there's your kind of axiomatic position, which you have to have at the start. That's your foundational position, which is that all worlds are constructed by the brain. But are there limits to that? Are there limits? Are there worlds that the brain shouldn't know how to build? Is basically my question here. And it's my position, having studied this for, well, many years now, that the DMT world seemed to transcend what ought to be possible based upon how we understand the brain to construct worlds, the information that it uses to do so, how it learns to construct worlds, how it's evolved to construct a world as a model of the environment, how dreams work, how these deeper archetypal structures work. You basically, through a process of elimination, you find that, okay, this isn't just a normal hallucination. It's nothing like dreaming. It's nothing like deeper archetypal structures. You know, what's left? How is it possible the brain is actually constructing these worlds? Because it has to. The fact that you can experience these worlds means that they are represented in the brain. You know, that's my foundational position. Some would disagree with that. You know, if you're a dualist and you think that perhaps it's the mind that's reaching out into this astral plane or something, that's a different perspective from mine, and I don't go there. But from my perspective, the DMT worlds are represented somehow in the brain. How is the brain doing this? Unless it has access to some external source of information, which is my kind of the position I lean towards these days. Yeah. I don't know if I answered the question there. I just rambled a bit.
Yeah. No, they segued literally perfectly to the next question I wanted to ask you, which was about the world models. And this is something that I've learned from your second book. I actually had no idea that was the case. Basically, you were describing the fact that the brain, for the most part, ignores most information because that's how it preserves energy. It builds world models and it essentially guesses these world models constantly outwards. And then only when there's some kind of an error signal between what the brain thought was supposed to happen and between, well, for now, let's just call it the external environment, whatever that means. But if there's some kind of impingement that is different, it goes, whoa, okay, well, let me reframe here. But now the reason the DMT is so different, according to what you're saying, is that, well, you don't just slightly depart from these error corrections. You literally wipe clean everything you've seen. The building blocks are different, and yet it's completely coherent material. So essentially, how can you explain the fact that the brain, essentially, if you think it's a hallucination, it literally manufactures super coherent content that is way more complex than this? The brain doesn't usually just exert energy for no reason like that. So that's one of the arguments that you make in the book, that this is a strong reason all by itself to take this a little bit more seriously.
Yes.
So first of all, I would love if you talk more about that, and as a like, just to throw it in there for you, is it true? You can start talking about it from any point, but if you can also address, is it true that part of the extended state studies eventually, is it true that the goal is to maybe keep people there long enough so they're going to create potentially world models that will make the content more coherent for them, so maybe they can interact with it in a way that is a little bit less bamboozling for them? Is that?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, yeah. So the world, it's always my axiomatic position on this is that the world that you experience, the subjective world, is always this model. The purpose of this model is to basically form a simulational space. Basically, it's a model that's designed to allow you to interface with the environment, whatever that is, the outside world, the external world, whatever you want to call it. And as you said, right, the brain is constantly, it has this model, and it's testing this model against sensory inputs. It's receiving these streams of sensory inputs, and it's saying, okay, if this model is working, then this is what I should see next, or this is the next pattern of sensory information. So it's trying to predict the evolution of sensory inputs over time. If it gets it correct, if the model is working well, then it makes very, very good, accurate predictions, and it says, okay, I don't need this sensory information because I already know, what's going to happen next. It's working, right? So this is a very economical and efficient way of working. Now, if something surprising happens, something that's not predicted by the model happens, then the brain needs to know about it because it suggests that the model is not working. And then the mismatch between the prediction and the actual sensory information generates this error signal, which is passed up into the deeper levels of the cortex and is used to update the model until these error signals come back down again. So it's a constant cycle. So the sensory information is like a training signal. It's a real-time training signal for the model. And this is why your world is so stable and coherent, is because it has this constant stream of sensory information that's acting as this real-time training signal. Now compare that to the dream state. Now when you go into the dream state, the brain tends to it's building the world in the same way, right? The dream world is built from the same stuff as the waking world, in that it's built from patterns of neural information generated by the cortex, but it lacks this sensory information training signal. So your brain knows how to build fairly decent models of the environment, even without sensory inputs. It's been learning how to do it, for millions of years, and since you were born, your brain was constantly developing its abilities to construct a model of the environment. But what you see in dreaming, which I think is quite telling, is that dreams tend to be much more unstable. They tend to be more kind of labile and fluid. They shift from scene to scene. Everything is detail tends to be lost in dreaming. It's one of the first things to go. Lucid dreamers, often they will look carefully at something and they see that it's not quite right, or you try to use a mobile phone or a calculator or read a book. All of these things require a stream of real-time sensory inputs, and this is why you lose all of this very fine detail in the dream state, and the whole thing is much more dynamic and fluid and unstable, right? One moment you're in the backyard, and then the next moment you're on an airplane, and then for some reason you find yourself somewhere else, and people change their identity before your eyes, all this kind of stuff. This is a real consequence, direct consequence of the loss of that training signal, that real-time sensory input training signal. So then we say, okay, so the brain is kind of good at building world models, but it's also not so good if you cut off sensory information. It can become very unstable. And then you see this DMT state, which basically has no relationship whatsoever to the world that your brain learned to build from the moment you were born. And throughout our evolutionary history, our brain evolved to construct a model of the environment. And then you move into the DMT state, and it begins constructing these completely different worlds that are far more complex, far more coherent, in many ways far more stable. The narrative coherency and complexity of these worlds is truly astonishing. We're told, of course, that the brain is just fabricating this. And it's like, wait a minute, the brain hasn't, as far as we know, the brain never learned to construct these worlds. The brain never learned to construct higher dimensional spaces filled with bizarre creatures that have no referent in the normal waking world. And so the idea that this is just the brain kind of fabricating it when perturbed by this molecule, to me, just doesn't make any sense. It's like the brain is speaking a language that it never learned to speak, fluently and effortlessly, with this license virtuosity. It's constructing these incredibly complex worlds, it's incredible speed and dynamism. And to me, the idea that this is just the brain making up, it doesn't make sense to me from a neuroscientific perspective, and understanding how the world is normally built. I would expect very unstable and very fluid and dynamic, but world that lacked that coherence, and that contained, as does dreaming, contains people from daily life. It contains domesticated animals. If you look at the content of dreams, it's people dream of dogs and cats and horses, and they dream about people they know, right? These are the models that your brain is constructing and learn to construct in normal waking life. So why we almost never see that in a DMT state. It's always these extremely alien beings that seem to come from nowhere and have no relationship to the beings that we meet in normal waking life. So yeah, that's why I think we need to take seriously this.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for and then to the point of, did I understand it correctly? Is that one of the goals of the extended state potentially, or I read too much into it? Is that the idea that maybe if you, I know it's way far in the future if at all, but if you do keep people there, I don't know, hours, days, or weeks, and somehow sustain their bodies, is it possible that they might create world models that actually bring information? So, okay, I'll just give you like a 30-second spiel that I feel like what my, one of my ideas about it, which is that if you have the immediate environment, which is the three-dimensional space that we seem to be in, whatever this system is doing, it basically found the local minima of like, okay, this is what you need for your reward functions, so you can eat, so you can not be eaten. There you go, right there. That's it, dialed in. So now there might be, and probably is, a lot of other information that is coming in, but it's just ignoring it because there's just too much energy and it doesn't actually give you any reward function. But it's possible that if you go way further out, all of a sudden you're going to meet a bubble where you might start evolving towards it, but you need to stay there for a while for your brain to kind of get enough of that information and connect it to what you already know here. So I don't know. I actually don't remember if my brain confabulated this. I don't remember if I read it somewhere that somebody said it about the extended state, or I don't know if I just kind of, that was my imagination told me. That's why I'm asking you if that's one of the goals.
Well, yeah, I have spoken about this kind of before a little bit, so maybe you heard it from there. But
Yeah, probably
basically,
from you. Yeah.
yeah, I mean there's a number of aims really. I mean the first and simplest, the most obvious aim is to allow people a longer period of time to explore the space and to analyze and to make sense of the space. Simply by virtue of having more time, not being restricted to this just 3 or 4 minutes basically in the breakthrough state. But beyond that, it was always my hope, at least, that over time, over much longer periods of time. So if we're not talking about 30 minutes, but we're talking about hours, and yes, maybe even days. I've spoken about this many times, the idea that actually eventually you will be on extended sojourns, extended excursions in the DMT worlds where your bodily needs would be taken care of. And the idea being that over time you would get some kind of restructuring. So your brain would, you described as kind of tune in or whatever, but yeah, you will get some restructuring of the brain, cortical connectivity restructuring as the brain effectively learns to construct an alternate reality and does so much more efficiently. I mean, it already does it with incredible efficiency. So, but which is again part of the mystery of DMT. But the fact that it can achieve it within a few seconds of DMT entering the brain is itself remarkable. But I think, yes, if you extend it over days or much longer, then there is going to be some neural restructuring going on, and you have effectively become integrated. So there's a number of stages that I like to think about. You have this kind of induction into the space, stabilization, orientation within the space, and that's what you get within 15, 20, 30 minutes, right? You get stabilization of the space so that you can explore it. But then over time, hypothetically, you would get more of an integration into the space where your brain actually becomes more firmly locked to this alternate. If there is some alternate information source, it would become firmly locked to it. So in the same way that in normal waking life, your brain is kind of locked into sensory inputs coming from the environment, and it's always receiving real-time data. The same thing, hopefully, or maybe not, hopefully, depending on your perspective. But the same thing could happen with much longer expeditions. If you're in there for a couple of weeks or something, you effectively become a citizen. You get your long-term visa. Your brain
Oh,
does
yeah,
anyway.
yeah. Okay, now I remember. You talked about it in your first book, and in the second one, you were
Maybe.
talking about the more. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I'm not putting words in your mouth. But yeah,
No, no.
most likely I heard it from you. So, is it possible in your mind? This is obviously a much more speculative question, but let's explore for a second. Is it possible in your mind that maybe there's certain kinds of even physical technologies that we won't be able to use unless we have a particular kind of mind? So, like, for example, maybe warp drive, even if you enter a craft that can do it technically, if you don't have a particular kind of ability to perceive certain elements of reality, you won't even be able to participate in the warp drive element of it. Is that a possible thing in your opinion?
Of course. I mean, we don't know anything about. I mean, one thing that DMT reveals, I think, is that we don't really know where we are within reality, if that kind of makes sense, right? We find ourselves within this, I always describe it as this little slice of reality, this lower dimensional slice, and we're not really sure of how our reality or our conception of reality actually fits together with perhaps some broader reality, and how we might, what is the relationship, what are the rules of interaction. Is DMT allowing you to interface with some broader high dimensional structure of which are actually always embedded? I mean, that's the basis of the first book, really. So yes, it's perfectly possible that the brain is this great information generator, and that's its primary function. All of these neurons, that what they're doing is they're generating information all the time, and so I always think the brain is how we're going to make contact. First of all, I think if we're going to make contact with some kind of advanced intelligence, it's going to be through the brain, because certainly beings that have transcended the physical, or have never existed perhaps in the physical wet brain, this lower dimensional form that we exist in, they're going to interface with us through our brains, because that's the most obvious direct route into our subjective conscious awareness. So I don't see that there would be any other way to do that. Well, there might be other ways to do it, but that would certainly be the most obvious way, would be for them to access our brains directly. And so, yes, it's science fiction stuff, but I can certainly see that, yeah, our brain is this information generator. How it interfaces with, the brain itself could be a slice of a much larger, more high-dimensional structure. Again, that's something I discuss in the first book, right? The idea that your brain becomes part, of this high-dimensional structure in the presence of DMT, that you are receiving information from these orthogonal dimensions, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think you could
It's
be
actually a
right.
little. It's a lot less wild for me to than to believe that we're going to be able to create contact with an alien civilization through radio waves, which is like this one tiny sliver of like something that we happen to right now do in our part of evolution. In this, like, it has to be
Yeah,
something
no,
more universal.
it's
An
absurd.
experience.
Yeah,
Yeah,
of
it
course.
is absurd. I don't know if you know, but wait, I was confusing with the actor. It's Gary Oldman and the researcher from, I think, is the one that is studying people who were abducted. What's his name? Is it Gary Nolan? Gary Nolan, not Oldman.
Gary Nolan, yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And he was talking about like some people come to him with all kinds of cases where, well, one in particular I remember where, when it was a mother and a daughter, they were sitting in the car and they saw something, and then they showed him a picture. In the picture there was actually something, but they both told him what we saw, both of us, was not what you see in the picture. So not even that wild to me that if they, either are off that space, whatever it is, the mind space, or they hacked that system, it shouldn't be that difficult to just use these probes to project whatever it is into whomever's looking. So, and you can, augmented reality, you can just specifically target this person to see this thing, this person to see something else, and nobody would agree about anything, but they're looking at the same thing. It's just projecting different things into their minds, essentially. Um,
Yeah.
I do think. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's really basically what I think is going on with DMT. I don't think it's a. I wouldn't say projecting something into their minds. The way I always formulate it is you're directing information to manipulate the world model. Basically, that's what you need to do if you want someone to see something. I mean, when I'm talking to you now, I'm perturbing your neural activity with the aim of generating meaning in your brain, right? That is the basis of communication. That's what we're all doing. We're all trying to manipulate each other's neural machinery to generate meaning and understanding, to transmit messages, right? That's how it works. And so, yeah, if you were highly sophisticated post-biological intelligence that was a million years more advanced than ours, then yeah, you would transmit information directly into the brain. You would perturb their world model such that you can control what they saw, basically. Yeah.
Pure meaning. You could communicate pure meaning. It always feels to
Mm.
me personally, I don't know, a lot of people have a lot of different experiences, but to me, it always feels like when the beings in the DMT space communicate, it's almost like a very, well, they communicate in a lot of different forms, but one of them is a very rapid, hot, cold game with your conjectures. So it's like you say, wait, you want to tell me that? And before you even begin to formulate the thought, they go like, yes or no. And like, they just go like that. So it's very sophisticated because, first of all, you don't get jarred by anything because you conjectured everything, so you already thought about it, and now all they have to do is to kind of guide you a little bit. And then obviously there's also other forms in which they kind of hand you an object and you just understand the thing. But I find that actually a very, when I thought about it later, I was like, oh my god, this is perfect. Like that way, nobody gets too uh, confused or just like traumatized, even though that can happen. But
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like it's a very it really feels like they can kind of see exactly what you're saying, your world models and what they intend, what they lean towards, and then they just basically play with these, like just like we use language, they speak meaning, like direct
Yeah.
meaning without the symbols, essentially. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of people describe that they speak in directly in meaning. It's impossible to talk about that and make sense to anyone who has not experienced it. But yeah, they dispense with the intermediary, which is symbols, basically.
Symbolic, yeah.
And simply, if you can manipulate someone's brain to make them understand something without having to use words, then I mean, my words are in a sense, yeah, they are intermediaries. I'm using the words to generate meaning in your head, but if I could simply stimulate your brain in the same way without using words, and you would presumably you would get the same sense of meaning without really understanding how you got that, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
I know kung fu. You just know kung fu. It's just
Right.
like
Yeah.
but
Right.
and I always thought about that. I don't know. I always think about these like things that you're not supposed to think about because it's just a cool moment in a film. But I always thought like, did he just know kung fu because it was uploaded into his brain, so to speak, or was a program ran that made him train kung fu for 40 years in his brain, and then he knew kung fu after 40 years being in that space. You know what I mean? So you still need to go through some of the wiggles. The computation still needs to happen at a certain speed. It still needs
Yeah.
to occur, right? Yeah. So, anyways, that's just a fun
Anyway.
thought. But bring it back to something a little bit more terrestrial, but still staying in that space. A few years ago, John Dean wrote that paper that claimed to have found that we have comparable amounts of dimethyltryptamine in our intracranial liquid with dopamine and serotonin on average throughout the day. First of all, is this something that we've established? Second of all, if so, do you think it is fair at this point to call DMT a neurotransmitter, or is it still too early to say things like that?
Well, you can't say it's a neurotransmitter. No, there are very strict there are very strict criteria of how a neurotransmitter is defined, and DMT satisfies some of those, but certainly not all of them yet. And of course, this study that John Dean published, it wasn't in human brains, so I mean, it was mammalian brain, so we can perhaps infer that
So,
it was.
so a maybe, but that we don't know yet
It's a
with people.
maybe, yeah. But the fact that it is interesting to me that it would be a startling coincidence if this molecule DMT was produced by the human brain for a completely different purpose, or simply as a side product, as some kind of shunt metabolite or something of tryptamine metabolism, and didn't have a function in the brain. Let's take that idea that it has a completely different function, but also just happens when you elevate it to physiological concentrations, just happens to gate access to this bizarre hyper-technological alien reality teeming with strange beings, strange otherworldly creatures. That to me would be, a startling coincidence. That this naturally occurring molecule just happened to do that. So I think there is something profoundly important about the fact that DMT is so ubiquitous, first of all, in the natural world, in the plant kingdom, but also the fact that it is produced, as you said, at reasonable concentrations. It's not simply a trace metabolite, but it's actually found in, as you said, the similar concentrations to other neuromodulators. That doesn't mean that it is, you're always under the influence of DMT, so to speak. A lot of it depends on how it interacts with receptors, and DMT is actually quite weirdly binds quite weakly to the 5-HT2A receptor, for example. So yeah, I mean, it's a blunt instrument. I mean, the molecule it's nothing to it, right? It's basically tryptamine with a couple of methyl groups which block this amine. Fascinating computational study from, a couple of decades ago now, but basically when you add these two methyl groups to it, and it blocks off that amine, so it turns it into a molecule that looks very, very boring pharmacologically. It looks like it shouldn't do anything. But not experientially, exactly, and that's what's so surprising about it. But yeah, it's this incredibly simple tryptamine produced in 2 steps from tryptophan, using very common enzymatic machinery that's found in the human brain. So it wouldn't surprise me, and we know it's found in humans. We know it's found in urine, and it's found in blood. No one's detected it actually in the brain of a human at this point, as far as I'm aware. But that experiment should be done.
Okay.
Yeah. What it means, I don't know.
What is the so from what you're saying, I think it's safe to assume then that it was a little over, at least at the moment, the claim that the brain specializes in breaking down dimethyltryptamine that claim is overblown at the moment, at least.
Well, I think it could be overblown. Yeah, I'm not sure that John Dean overblows it, so to speak.
No, not John Dean. It was going around, like in pop culture, people kind of say, the brain specializes and this is why it dissipates so quickly. And I simply don't know enough about the technicalities. So would you say that?
I mean, certainly that is another feature that is interesting. I mean, there's a number of pharmacological peculiarities that would have you believe that it is an endogenous neurotransmitter, endogenous neuromodulator, I would say, rather than a neurotransmitter as such, but that it is broken down so efficiently by the brain. It doesn't hang around. It binds relatively weakly to a receptor, so it binds and it's off and it's broken down. It has a very rapid, this is very important for neurotransmitters. You don't want them hanging around too long. You want an efficient means of getting rid of them. There are a number of ways to do that, but rapid metabolism, one of the fastest enzymes in the world is acetylcholine esterase. I mean, this is extremely, one enzyme is like several thousand per second. It can, incredible stuff. And the fact that it doesn't have subjective tolerance as well. You'd also expect this for an endogenous. So what you see with LSD is when it, or psilocybin, is when it binds to this 5-HT2A receptor over time, you get this desensitization effect where the 5-HT2A receptor, the main locus for their effects, stops working basically and is then retrieved from the membrane and broken down and recycled. You don't see that with DMT. It doesn't for reasons that aren't quite clear, you don't get that desensitization effect, which means that DMT, you can give it to people repeatedly, and you have the same effect every time. You don't get that any kind of tolerance, or not significantly anyway. Then it's a bit of a grey area, but basically, yeah, it's unique in that you don't see that tolerance. So everything, all the pieces come together that there is an intimate relationship between DMT and the human brain, but it's not been kind of proven yet that it is an endogenous neurotransmitter in humans.
So wait, do we even know that the body makes any of it? Because I heard some claims that your lungs make it, or so your body does make some of it.
So there's a number of pieces of basically numbers of lines of evidence, some from animals, some from humans. So we know that humans make it because it's detected in human fluids, it's detected in human urine, it's detected in human blood. We know that it's found, and that's been 100 studies at least since the 1950s have found DMT in humans. So we know it's there. But then you've got these animal lines of evidence where you can dissect, of course, much more easily and get access. And certainly rabbits and rats and mice and this kind of thing, you can detect in brain, you can detect it in lung. I mean, the lungs, that's where initially Julius Axelrod back in the 50s, maybe 60s, he isolated this INMT, this indole N-methyl transferase enzyme. This is the key enzyme that methylates the tryptamine to form dimethyltryptamine, DMT. This is very heavily expressed in the lungs. So the lungs would be a good site for DMT synthesis. It also dovetails with the idea that DMT, that we know now that DMT protects the brain under hypoxic conditions. So neurons will survive longer under hypoxic conditions, so lack of oxygen, when DMT is present, and that's via the sigma receptor. So a completely different effect, completely different receptor.
That's the stroke study, right? They showed that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so this is Edie Fresca, Dennis McKenna was involved as well, I think. But this would fit, of course. You know, if you have if your lungs stop working, then this could be, in theory, it makes sense that this might be a site where you detect that hypoxia, and that's where the DMT is produced and goes straight into the brain because it passes the blood-brain barrier. And basically, it's the body's last-ditch attempt to keep the brain functioning should oxygen levels rise again. So if you survive and you start breathing again, then the brain is protected because your body is producing DMT. If you don't make it and you do pass on, then your near-death experience, or not your death experience, would be a DMT trip. So the whole thing, and that goes back to Rick Strassman's idea of the pineal gland. I don't think it's the pineal gland at all. I don't think the pineal's involved.
That's really interesting because I'm sure you know this is like people are like all over that shit. This is like their
yeah. I don't get involved with pineal people because it's part of it's their mystical pineal.
No, I understand exactly.
They're decalcifying their pineal, and it's like, okay. You do you.
Wait, so I really want this is perfect. Thank you. And I know we have only a very short time left, so I'm going to ask you one final thing about the boring technical stuff, and then we'll maybe do one more question about something out there. Is it not, because again, it's kind of hard to tell between the, as Terrence used to call it, between shit and shinola when it comes to like the fun rants of different people and then the actual scientific ideas. There was a fun Joe Rogan rant, which is always a good beginning of a sentence to ask about anything specific. But is it not true that certain lizards and amphibians, I guess what you would call the pineal gland, have some kind of a like unevolved cornea and a lens? That is not true, or you just don't know?
That could well be true. I mean, I think the pineal is the site of melatonin synthesis, right? And melatonin synthesis goes up when light goes down, right? As the sun goes down, your pineal gland starts to produce melatonin, which is important in regulating the sleep cycle, right? It makes you sleepy and that kind of thing. Now your actual eyes, so to speak, have taken over that task. They are the source and the main source of detecting when the lights are dimmed. But there's no reason to think. I mean, I don't know about the lizard specifically, but it would make sense that the pineal could be a light detector, and that would make sense if it was regulating the sleep-wake cycle. Then it makes sense that it has to have some way of knowing when it's night. And that
And
obviously
the
would
eyes are
be.
also part of the brain, right? So like it would make sense because they say the pineal gland is not exactly part of the brain, but it's attached to it, and the same as the eyes, or that's not accurate to say.
It's. I mean, you can say this is like anatomical kind of nomenclature. Is
Yeah,
it part of
right,
the
right,
brain?
right.
Sure, it's in there. It's part of the brain. It's attached to everything. Are the eyes part of the brain? Yeah, in a way they are, I guess, right? They're also separate in that they're the eyes and they're facing outside. We don't normally consider them part of the brain, but sure, the optic nerve, the optic tract connects into the thalamus and then the rest of the brain, so that the eyes are also part of the brain. You can say that about the whole nervous system. We
Yeah,
just
yeah,
we
yeah. I'm
thought,
not so much to make anything out of it. I guess it's just like I'm appeasing my OCD to know these things for sure, because not every day I talk to someone like you with so much knowledge. Let's end with something a little bit more, maybe a little bit more out there. What would we always have these things, where there's the rigorous part. Obviously, you're a scientist and you have to maintain certain, seriousness about particular things and not say the things you don't know. But if you have to watch, like when you're alone and you just, you're out and just thinking about this stuff sometime, if you do, what is the, what, what, what is the edge of reality as you see it at the moment? What is the most like out there thought that you've had with your understanding of this whole space? Because I'm a big proponent of Max Tegmark's idea of whatever the truth is, if it fits something that you thought it was, it's definitely not it. And so what is that like weirdest thing that kind of puts you inside out, that you personally, you Andrew Gallimore, it really animates you?
well, that's a difficult question. I mean, there's so many things. I mean, in my first book, I think that's the furthest out I've been in terms of basically structuring the entirety of reality around DMT. Basically, the idea that this reality is this lower dimensional slice of this high dimensional structure, and the whole purpose of our existence is to find a way out, and it is like this grand cosmic game. I think reality could be like that. I don't see that our slice of reality is it. I think we've no conception of our true place within a broader reality, and I don't think we necessarily have the ability to conceive of the nature of what's out there. So in a way, you anything can go. I mean, there's nothing we can say, and this is why I think the phenomenology of DMT and going in there without an ideological position about what's going on. As soon as people start talking to me, these are jinns or demons or
Oh,
deities.
I'm with you, man. I'm with you. Yeah, this is like
Once you label them and say they're this, and I refer to them, these beings, I mean, I do lean towards the idea that you are interfacing with some kind of intelligence, right? That's no secret now. I think it's very difficult to explain the DMT experience otherwise. Other people would disagree with that, but I've always simply referred to it as some kind of intelligent agent. I don't know what that is. I've never referred to it as a god or a spirit or a deity or an alien or anything like that. It could be something like that. In the end, there might not be any difference between a god or an alien or whatever, right? Or a spirit or whatever. So I think, to me, that is I can't think of a more profound discovery for humanity. Would be not that we exist within a broader reality, which I think many scientists have postulated well, not for millennia. Well, for millennia, but I mean seriously, for a century at least, the idea that we are one universe within a multiverse, or parallel universes, all of this stuff is kind of the bread and butter of the kind of Brian Greene and the string theorists, and the people who like to be interviewed on television programs and draw equations on whiteboards. These people love talking about parallel universes. But
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sliced bread.
Right.
Yeah.
The sliced bread theory or whatever, right? Many worlds interpretation. And it's all good fun, but I don't think they necessarily believe it, or they don't see there's any obvious implication to it, right? These are mathematical abstractions for the most part, and they might have implications for how energy is detected or whatever. But for the most part, these can be kind of safely tucked away within the more advanced branches of mathematical physics, and you can keep them. You don't have to worry about them. But what DMT does is says, actually, you do need to worry about them, because you can go there right now. There is another intelligence, and it's not speculative. It's not something that you can theorize about or propose. It's not like proposing there's a parallel universe where everything's the same apart from one little thing's very different, right? Depending on how the universe splits, and that's all good fun, but you never have to actually confront this alternate self of yours in this other parallel universe. Whereas DMT says, actually, not only do these intelligences exist, but they're right here, they're right now, and you can access them within 30 seconds from now. You can access them. Intelligences that are beyond your comprehension, that are inordinately more advanced, intelligent, powerful, and timeless than you could ever even possibly conceive of. I think most people aren't. I don't know, well, maybe you can't be ready to confront that, but I can't see anything that is more astonishing and more profound and more important than that realization. We're not talking about credos passed down in books about, the gods and things like this, things that you believe in or things that you worship or things you pray to, but a being that you can actually right now confront and enter into an interaction with. That is, I think, beyond most people's comprehension of anything they've ever considered. So that's why I think DMT is so important, because it allows anyone on the planet who can source one of the countless DMT containing plants and spend a few hours in a kitchen. Anybody can access this. You don't need special equipment. You don't need authority from anyone. You don't need anyone to tell you anything. You just you inhale this vapor and you are there in that space. It's going to horrify you. It's going to shock you. It's going to appall you. It's going to shake you to your ontological bones. But that's the kind of the amazing thing about DMT, is that it is so democratic.
Wow, I can't think of a more perfect note to end on. Thank you for this. Because I actually use this term too. It's perfect. It doesn't get more democratic than this. And I thank you for being so coherent on the subject and so concrete.
I'm not sure I was that coherent, but I was. Yeah.
No, I think you are. I think that maybe it's just my bias because you kind of speaking my language. I'm like, yes, tell me more. It's because there's nothing that turns me off more than people that, with so much certainty, they just assert that they know what it is. I'm like, dude, we've been wrong about everything since being early hominids for 2 million years. What are the chances you figured it out? Also, reiterating an idea we just read in a book. Like, can you allow reality to land on you for a second without you immediately overlaying a thing on it? It's so crazy to me. And gods and angels, that's kind of expected. But it's also with like the newer ideas. All of a sudden, there's this memeplex about like, I'm all about that we are waking up to our greater understanding of what we are and all that stuff. But can you allow it to unfold first before you decide for it what it is? Just let it.
Yeah.
I don't know how people go into the DMT space and come back with a story about angels. I'm like, dude, this is like what are you talking about? This is like the most confusing thing ever. But anyways, I maybe that was my bias that made really was gobbling up the rant. But I really appreciate you taking the time, Andrew, and you're always a pleasure to talk to. And yeah, maybe we'll do it again at some point. Very excited about your new book.
Sure.
I'm going to put all the links in the description. And yeah, man, please keep doing what you're doing. You're incredible. And thank you.
Thank you very much. See you again.